Okay, let's talk about essentiality on a slightly deeper level here. Most people believe that Ein Sof is pure and open, and it exudes a light that becomes the currency of creation. That's the creative power. So in an emanationist system, in the usual system, Ein Sof spits out this light as a creative byproduct. And that's where emanationism starts. Emanationism doesn't start with Keter. The real logic of emanationism starts in what's called the Tzachot, which means the splendors, that there's levels and levels and levels that have to be dealt with above Keter, above Absolute, that Hermetic Kabbalists generally don't talk about. It's an inconvenient truth, we could say. So where does emanationism start? Well, it starts with how you deal with the luminosity that is exuded by the openness. Like if Ein Sof is purely open as an expanse of pure possibility, how does it come to express its light? Well, if you believe that the light is emanated from Ein Sof, then you're an emanationist. And then it steps down level to level to level and so forth. What I'm saying is the alternative to that is to say that they are equal and the light is not diminished in any way. It is not a byproduct. It's not a created entity. It's not a product at all. What I'm saying is that Ein Sof and the open expanse of possibility just simply glows. And the self-glow of that potency is the potency and not a product of it. It doesn't come from Ein Sof. It is Ein Sof. It's Ein Sof glowing and glowing in transparency. So I start my non-emanationism right from the essence, and I never depart from it. That Ein Sof glows as its or. That's the or Ein Sof. There is no division there. There is no diminishment there. There is no creation there. And that's controversial. Okay? But we know that that light, the light of Ein Sof, is what's drawn down into the vacated space and utilized level to level to level. And it becomes both what knows reality, which is consciousness, and what is known in reality, and that becomes the objects the consciousness perceives. Now, here's a major problem in Hermetic Qabalah. Hermetic Kabbalists, and Jewish Kabbalists too, tend to reify both what knows, which are the levels of the soul, and what is known, which are the contexts of that conscious knowing, and those become the worlds. So you take your reification habit from world to world and level of consciousness to level of consciousness, and you divide these things into functions of a subject against the perceived objects that that subject engages, and you consider them very different. I'm in this world. I'm going to that world. I'm experiencing it with this level of the soul. I'm moving to that level of the soul. If you and I'm not saying that that doesn't present itself, because that's our reality displayed in that way. But what I'm saying is that ironclad division between worlds and souls that articulates the chain, the hierarchical chain that people think that they're in, they're very rigid about it. And if you invite that transparency of wholeness through that same system, you don't have to throw away the system. You just open it up. You toss away the rigidity. The rigidity sucks.
Yeah.
It's reification.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem. That's the biggest complaint you get too about people who have done the Golden Dawn style sort of Kabbalistic correspondence system. It's, I think you have to understand these things as, at least in your practice, you've got to leave yourself flexibility. It can't be a one-to-one. You can't be so obsessed with having this one-to-one, fitting things into neat little boxes. At the end of the day, it's a conceptual scaffolding, really, for at least in magical work, which is not necessarily what we're talking about here, but is I do know it's going to be the perspective uh, with which a lot of people come to this presentation. So
Well, it could be what we're talking about here in a very direct way, because the view that I'm talking about absolutely can enhance people's magic. And I think that in order to perceive reality as truly magical, you have to do what I'm talking about.
mhm.
So I think that it is completely um, um, adaptable and usable by all phases and practices of magic in the systems that you're talking about, because it to me is the root of them. How can you expect magical change to actually occur unless you believe that reality is inherently magical? And the only way to believe that reality is inherently magical is to hold a magical view in which anything and everything can happen from the deepest possible root without descending into ordinariness. Well, that's what we're talking about here. So if you treat phenomena magically, you could do anything and
Yeah.
be anything.
Well, and let me bring this up to you, because this too, I'd like you to talk a little bit about. I agree with you here completely on it really creating a real sense of potency in your practical work magically. But I do know that, as somebody who's a non-theist and a non-emanationist, you're not really interested in working with quote unquote spiritual entities, right? Because it's a big part of magic, and I want you to maybe talk to people about that view, your perspective on that.
Okay, well, when Pseudo Dionysus said a denial of all beings, what was he really talking about? He's basically saying that no spirit, no angel, no intelligence, no mode of consciousness can modify or manipulate the essence at all.
Hmm.
They can manipulate appearance, the display of appearance, these entities, but they don't do shit to the essence. They are expressing the same essence that you and your actions are expressing. So I'm not denying, in a logical sense, the denial of all beings is not a denial in a logical sense of the appearance of those beings and their functions. They're fine.
Hmm.
It's just they have nothing to do with the essence. And my whole thing is essentiality and view and employing it in contemplative mysticism.
Mhm.
I am not against the magic that calls upon angels and spirits whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I totally promote it and support it. I'm just encouraging people to apply a deeper view while they're doing it,
Mhm.
and it will enhance their work. I mean, I don't talk about my own practice, but I do a lot of stuff like that too. But it's irrelevant to this discussion. And really, my point is to make a point about something that people don't talk about, which is the basic view of reality and how it should be treated as a mystic. And then you do whatever you do, magically or otherwise, or even in a mundane sense, and it changes.
Right.
It's just as simple as that. So, do I emphasize or write about in my books or talk about spirits and angels and entities that inhabit these realms? No, I never talk about it. But it doesn't mean I'm against it.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that I deny it as effective. It's just what's the main point here? What's the heart of the matter? You know, the heart of the matter to me is not that. You know, the heart of the matter is the view that is presented that can be then applied to something. So you're talking about with entities, really a discussion of functionality, how the shaping of the worlds comes out and what can be called upon in that shaping, right? I'm saying that I'm turning my attention to what is being shaped
Mhm.
rather than the shaping. And the
Mhm.
shaping, believe me, will take care of itself, or we can help it along magically. Either way, that's another discussion,
Mhm.
right? I would rather understand what is being shaped in that process, both in terms of my own mind and the phenomena that that mind expresses and evokes. Now, of course, I come from a background of magical work. I mean, I started out in a Golden Dawn offshoot 30 years ago.
Mm.
So I can relate.
Yeah,
I just don't write about that stuff.
prudence.
And you really have to take that line from Pseudo Dionysus, the denial of all beings, in a very open kind of way, because it's not a rejection of beings. It's a denial of their separate existence, their separateness. It's a denial of the reification of them.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Yeah, they present themselves, of course. I mean, all you have to do is do a little bit of magical work or take a psychedelic, and you'll see them. They'll show up. I mean, guaranteed. The question is, then what? Are you
Right.
going to approach the appearance of this phenomena with a conventional view or not?
Right. And you become enmeshed with even in theurgy, where you're not necessarily trying to manipulate anything material per se, you're still becoming enmeshed with a series of middlemen. You know?
Yes, well, you deal with those middlemen the same way you deal with the rest of reality. You know, um, really, the middlemen are shaping the display, and whether you want to participate in that process with them or not is the question for most magicians.
Mhm.
But the real fundamental question is, how do you get in that situation and change who and what you are from the outset?
Mm.
Because if you change your own habits of reification, you become a different order of being yourself. And this is actually what Pico said, become like the angels
Mm.
first, and he was the Christian Kabbalist, Hermetic Kabbalist prototype for
Yeah,
everybody. And
that's right. Yeah.
he got it right in that sense, but he didn't elaborate really too much. But
Yeah, he had a lot on the docket and he in a very short time to to get any of it out. So
that's
unfortunately,
right. But he did make statements of becoming as the angels were, essentially, essentially becoming more than a conventional human being.
hmm. And and that's that's a one of the the I would say preoccupations with somebody in the that somebody that had been initiated into the inner order of the Golden Dawn would have, right, is to become more than human. That is by this sort of elevation. Again, using that verticality, that
Well,
proximity.
that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I also find something really striking where you're talking about it's not just consciousness itself, it's the things that are perceived, and you're talking about a luminosity. And I think that'll be familiar to a lot of people in what Plato has to say about the one, particularly in books 6 and 7 of the Republic, where he talks about why he uses the visible sun as his analogy, his analog.
Absolutely. The one true, good, beautiful ideal of Plato is the transparency that I'm talking about. It's the self luminous transparency of open possibility. I
Yeah.
am absolutely with Plato on that.
And
You
he
know,
dances around it quite a lot in the dialogues, and also part of that is not great Anglophone translations, so, in some instances, but still, he it's something that he approaches obliquely. He can't really talk directly about it.
so why is it true? Because it's real. Why is it good? Because it's inherently full of all possibility. Why is it beautiful? Because its outpouring gives us every possible thing we need, and the vision of it is absolutely splendid, miraculous, and we're in a state of wonderment when we contact it. So the true, the good, and the beautiful is gnosis
Mm.
in the highest mystical sense.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I see you've kind of got that. You've got that here also. You've got gnosis written down on this image, which by the way,
Yes, now
is
that gets us to
beautiful.
the next point
This
here. I
is
keep
a stunning image, David. This is an incredible image. I love this.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, the reason why I put this image here, especially after the last image, which had the Tzimtzum in it, and remember in that last image we had a quadrisected circle. We had the four directions, the four quadrants in the Tzimtzum, because that's how we perceive the expansive space, is a fourfold squared circle. In this particular case, when we're talking about essentiality, what's being depicted here are all of these little tiny circles, which are like the sparks of that residue of perfection within imperfection. And it's just full, it's just teeming with sparks. And that's the Rishimu within the Halala Panui that I mentioned. That's
Mm.
the basis of a miracle of being able to tap into the infinite within what appears finite. It's right there
Mm.
if you have the eyes to see it. So down at the bottom of the left-hand part of the screen here, I go back to that thing that I was saying where there's two viable options. You know, you can approach your esoteric work with conventionality, which basically means with some degree of reification, with some degree of misinterpretation of what's going on, right? Ordinary mind. Or you could cut right to the sublime essentiality, which we're not going to do perfectly, but it doesn't mean that we can't try. If you have the mentality to view your life as a terrible splendor, then of course you're going to get it wrong, but we act as if. That's the only way that we're going to, acting as if is the only way that we're going to break through. So, how do you make yourself into a saint? How do you make yourself into a realizer? Well, you try, you fucking try, and you fail, and you try again, you know, and you act as if it is a life or death scenario, which it is,
Yeah.
literally. And if you approach your work as like you're playing for your life and you try to do this impossible thing, right? Gnosis is like impossible for the human mind. But if you try for the if you don't try for the impossible, you're not going to get the impossible. And we have a long historical record of mystics who've accomplished this. So it's not impossible, is it? You
Mm.
know, you don't have any, you don't have pseudo Dionysus unless it's possible.
Right, and this brings the practitioner back to a question of their why. Why are you doing this? This is a really good way to find where you're at. Like, are you doing this because you're interested in some sort of, quirky side quest? Is that why you put on robes and act like a magician, or are you trying to get to essentiality? And I talk about it maybe somewhat pejoratively. I don't necessarily mean it that way. I'm being facetious to make a point. I'm trying to exaggerate the situation so that, to encourage people to take a closer look at, what's the point? Why are we doing this?
Well, um, we could say in the vernacular, in a conventional sense, to love the divine. If you
Well,
love the
and
divine,
you've said that is like the only necessity, really, right?
yeah, yeah. If you, yes, yes, and I'll even go one step beyond that. It's completely sufficient, right? A love of the divine is all you need. It's sufficient in itself. It's perfect in itself. Because if you love, and we'll talk about what this means because it has to do with how Chesed mitigates the byproducts of Gevura, which I really want to talk to you about in technical Kabbalah, and the people listening to you will really be able to use that stuff. So let's
Mhm.
get through some of these points. But if you love the divine deeply enough, you are erasing the separation between the divine and your perception of yourself as distanced from it. So
Mhm.
essentially, you're mitigating the gap of the Tzimtzum in your life
Mhm.
through loving, because love is a very interesting thing. It is naturally all pervasive. That's its nature. The nature of love is to pervade what is being loved. And in that pervasion, you are negating the fragmentation and the separation and the distance and the contrast and the duality that causes a disruption in the love and makes it imperfect, right?
Mhm.
So inviting the force of chesed into a world that is dominated by the constriction of gevura mitigates the gevura. This is Kabbalah 101, and certainly that is a huge topic in Hasidic Kabbalah, which, by the way, Hasidic Kabbalah, occultists would love it if they actually saw what was going on there. They would just go nuts if they saw Likutei Moharan by Rebbe Nachman of Breslov presented in the right way, weeding out the religious bullshit, God this, God that, the commandments, okay, you just take that stuff out. You keep the esoteric core of that. You got rocket fuel in there. All right, so let's go to the next image. Okay, what we have here is a model of the Sefirot that's a little bit different, okay? On the right, you have the Or Ein Sof up on top. I already mentioned this word, that's Sak Sak Ot. It's basically everything that goes on beyond Keter of Atzilut. Okay. When we engage with that, or when we invite that into all phenomena, meaning when we invite that to be expressed through our perception of the Sefirot, the place where the change has to be made is Keter. The transformation is made at the root, where either the transparency that I'm talking about or the opacity of the normal conceptual state defines how that Keter is actually functioning. And in the Zohar, you get three basic ways that this bears out that I will talk about in a little while. But based on how transparent that root becomes, the supernal attributes of Chokhmah and Bina will act accordingly and perform. But it's particularly in Bina, which is the basic space of all phenomena, that the Sefirot live and move and have their being. So the kind of Malkut that you get is really dependent on what kind of space Bina is allowed to provide. And if the view of essentiality is really adhered to in a pure and pervasive way, that space of Bina is full of Chokhmah, full of the dynamism of Chokhmah, and they are inseparable. And the father and mother are in perfect union. The way that we figure this out is what we do with the whole middle of the tree and the attributes that we face and how badly we mangle their misinterpretation. And that's where all of magic happens, in that middle zone of the middle six Sefirot and their display as Malkut. So what I have in this diagram is very interesting, because I'm pointing out that when you apply the attribution of the Tetragrammaton to the Sefirot, that Yud, He, Vav, He, okay, the Yud corresponds with Chokhmah, but the tip of that letter is Keter. So it's Keter and Chokhmah at the same time. That's the traditional attribution of it. Bina is the upper He. Malkut is the lower He. And the six Sefirot between them are the Vav, numerical value 6. The question is, when we're faced with interpreting the Sefirot, how much of our conceptual habituation is imposed upon this? Well, if we impose our conceptual habituation on the Sefirot, we actually displace Malkut by considering it a byproduct. If we reify the crap out of it, that middle pillar drops down in a certain way. And I'm going to next show you diagrams that articulate this so that everybody will see. If we don't do that, we raise the entire middle pillar one notch. And in those two scenarios, everything changes. This is more or less, and I'm not saying direct, please don't misinterpret me, but this is more or less implied in the Golden Dawn symbolism in the shift between the outer order and the inner order.
Yes, exactly. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was doing that work, I had that in my mind. And when I saw it in Kabbalah later, I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, the second Adam being crucified on the infernal waters of Da'at,
Right.
having to go up.
Yeah, what they're talking about is repairing the shattering of the vessels in the klipot, right? Yeah.
And is this kind of an invention of in terms linguistically of modern quote unquote Kabbalah, or would you call that the Tikkun Ha'olam, you know?
Yeah, that's the Tikkun Olam, right?
Okay.
That's exactly what we're talking about, and it's not modern. It's the most traditional, ancient part of the system, right? So ask me anything you want about this, and then I'll show you that diagram that I was talking about next.
So the disposition here, I mean, just in trying to wrap my head around the diagram itself, the way that you've got it kind of formulated now with the tetragrammaton formula, is that kind of mirroring a four or really five worlds kind of thing that you've got going on here? I'm just
Yes,
curious. Okay.
yes. Well, there's different ways to show it. None are right or wrong. They emphasize different aspects, and you could articulate it, as trees in five worlds, or you could use a single tree model. It doesn't really matter because the structure of the symbolism can be adapted in, variety of ways. But yeah, that's the point, the basic point I'm trying to make before I get to the next point,
Okay.
where how we drop that middle pillar through our conceptuality, this is where it comes from. I don't want anybody to get confused.
Right.